Our first speaker, Martin Garbus, is one of the important lawyers of our time. Very important in terms of his advocacy of human rights abroad, whether in the former Soviet Union, in Chile, or in the Union of South Africa. Somebody also deeply involved even in the constitution of post-communist Czechoslovakia. At home, Martin Garbus has been deeply involved in issues involving the First Amendment and in the promotion of the sort of freedom of expression, which is obviously one of the key themes of our conference this afternoon. Martin Garbus has also had a striking list of celebrity clients, one of whom we'll be hearing about right now.
I'm very sorry that before this conference started, you all haven't had a chance to see either a video or a movie of Lenny Bruce. To hear all this commentary about someone you've never seen or perhaps heard on a DVD would be like me trying to explain to someone something about a Rembrandt portrait that you've never seen or a book that you've not read, because none of this can really capture who he was, and the difference between who he was and what he became was startling. I first met him in San Francisco before the prosecutions and before he became to be considered such an icon. And the most significant thing about Lenny's personality was his humility. And that humility followed him when he was at the top of his game until the last days of his life, when he was kind of, society really had forced him to the bottom of his game. He had disdain for those people who were trying to elevate him into exactly the kind of person we're talking about here. No one would have been more astonished than he, perhaps me, at what we see here today, the various analyses of sentences. We also have a distinguished person in the audience, Charlie Nesson, who was involved in the United States Supreme Court at the time that they turned down his petition. If Charlie were the judge, they would have granted his petition. I think that in order to, I remember when Nixon gave his I am a crook speech, and I said, I wish Lenny were here. And then when we heard Clinton say it's the definition of what is, I wish Lenny were here. And as we watch Donald Trump and Hillary, I say, I wish Lenny were here. I think it's important to know what the atmosphere was. One of the things that Christy mentioned was the diversity of the country, how things can be said now that couldn't be said before. All this is cyclical. When you have a man like Trump, it may be that many of the things that we thought for so long we had gained and were going to be a permanent part of the culture became very different. It's interesting to look at Bruce and the time and the reasons for his prosecution, because what it tells you is that many of the same things that were relevant then are relevant to today. The case dealt with the manipulation of the legal system. It dealt with prosecutorial misconduct. It deals with all of the issues that today, as we talk about criminal reform, surfaced in Lenny's trial. The prosecution of Lenny was caused by a group in New York of something called Operation Yorkville, which was on the east side of Manhattan. There was a man named Father Hill, and he was running around New York trying to pick up stuff that he thought was dirty. Frank Hogan was going to run for office, DA, and he seized upon Operation Yorkville as something to run on, the whole question of obscenity prosecutions, etc. Now, at this time with Lenny, you have to look back at the culture to understand exactly what was going on. The case doesn't arise from nothing. At that time, you had to have a license in New York to show certain kind of films. The licensing boards were prevalent throughout the United States. For example, a film with Anna Magnani called The Miracle, that couldn't be shown in New York. I was before the Supreme Court in a case from Ohio involving a Jean Moreau film, which couldn't be shown in the United States. And of course, there was Barney Rossett and the Lawrence and Miller prosecutions. But the unique thing about Lenny is that he was alive and there. Lawrence wasn't there, Miller wasn't there. I Am Curious was just a movie. So Lenny was a human being who got caught up in this. And what's important to see is looking at him and looking at the times, and then just trying to think about today's times. You saw extraordinary forces in the United States. The 60s were upon us. The reaction to the 60s was upon us. In the DA's office in Manhattan, there was enormous resistance to the prosecution altogether. A few DAs refused to prosecute. They were asked to be part of the team. Richard Q., who was then the prosecutor, ultimately took it on himself. He did it politically because he wanted to succeed Hogan. And he then ran for the DA basically on the basis of the prosecution of Lenny Bruce. I tried to run in the primary. It was the Bruce case was the keynote. I didn't get very far. Ultimately, Robert Morgenthau ran, and he won. The other thing I think that's important to mention is that at the trial, seated at the trial, and it didn't get that much attention, Lenny didn't become the icon, the hero he was, until after the trial, really. Sitting at the trial was Philip Roth, who had not yet written Portnoy's Complaint. He had written When She Was Good and Letting Go. Sitting at the trial was Allen Ginsberg, who was then an uptight student in Columbia. Sitting at the trial was Jules Pfeiffer. And also sitting at the trial, Elaine May, Mike Nichols, and other people who were extraordinarily influenced by what was going on. What Philip said then and since then, that I couldn't have written Portnoy's Complaint if Lenny had not been there. And Ginsberg, who I spoke to over the years, also talked about the effect of Lenny on these people. It's not the immediate effect and the things that they did. With respect to Lenny's humility, sophistication, and unawareness, at the time of the trial, what he wanted to do was to take the stand and testify. The way the prosecution got the conviction was not solely on the words. The DA was too sophisticated, and New York was too much of an involved place, a committed place. You just couldn't prosecute somebody for words. So what they did is they sent in someone called Inspector Rouet, and he went to the trial, and he observed the trial. And then at the trial, it became not just the prosecution for words. Inspector Rouet got up in the stand, and he gave his notes on what Lenny Bruce's performance was. His note, Rouet was humorless, he was uneducated, basically. He really had no sense of what the performance was. And then what Rouet did is he took the top of the microphone, and he did something like this, which would be like a priest making a benediction or a blessing, and Rouet translated that into masturbation. So the result was Lenny was convicted not just because of his words, he was convicted for his physical conduct as well. I could go on, as I told Steve, for 2 hours. I don't have 2 hours. So I just want to tell you, I hope that sometime you'll have a chance to see some of what Lenny actually talked about. When he talked about Eleanor Roosevelt or Jackie Kennedy, the icons of her time, or when he talked about race, I've heard here conversations comparing him to Mort Saul and other people. Lenny was unique at that time. There was nobody doing what he did at all. It wasn't Dick Gregory, it wasn't Mort Saul. He was a singular voice, and I think the great tragedy is that he's not here today. Thank you.
Our next speaker is a longtime and cherished friend of the archives and special collections at Brandeis University in particular, and it's a pleasure now to welcome Arlen Ettinger.
Thank you, Steve. When I was asked to be here, I wasn't quite sure what I would speak about, but I realized that as a young teen, three people that certainly influenced my life, perhaps more than any other, were Rosa Parks, Bob Dylan, and Lenny Bruce. Years later, when I set out to start an auction house that would take a different direction, try to incorporate important collections in the world of art and collectibles, I never did lose sight of the inspiration that those three remarkable people provided for me. The earliest experience I can recall where something we did seemed to make a difference was when a man came up to me, desperate to raise $30,000 to pay hospital bills for his daughter. He had no money, but he had a room full of about 90 wooden carousel figures that he described as having gotten as a boy in the 1930s by hanging around Philadelphia area amusement parks and watching workmen intentionally destroy the carousels by creating bonfires. And he would say something like, "Hey, mister, don't burn that horse, could I have it?" And they would say, "Sure, kid, why not?" And he gathered these figures in that way. As it turned out, 100 years ago, carousels were the most popular amusement you could go to, but they had lost favor to more challenging, newer rides. So here we were now, 40 some odd years later, and he has these 90 figures behind his home. And he asked if we would sell them to help his daughter with the hospital bills. And I took a look at the figures and knew no more than anyone else. There were no books on the subject at the time. No one knew who carved these figures a century earlier. But they clearly were fascinating. You could see different carvers' hands at work, and certainly seemed worthy of preservation. So we began a grassroots research project to discover who carved these. As it turned out, most of them were carved by Eastern European Jewish immigrants who had come to this country and settled in places like Coney Island and Philadelphia and New Haven, and created really these remarkable figures. Well, we conducted that auction, and the fact that they sold for $1 million was certainly a blessing for our consignor, a wonderful thing for us, but more importantly, following that event, these figures never after saw the flames of a bonfire. They've now ended up at the Smithsonian, many, many other museums where they very much reflect a part of our heritage. Not much after that, I heard a rumor about how the SS United States, the glory of our maritime fleet, the largest ocean liner ever built in the United States, was about to be towed out to sea, and the contents of its more than 1,000 rooms dumped overboard in the North Atlantic. And I said to myself, well, how silly is that? What a crime. There are certainly ocean liner buffs, and maybe more importantly, the tens of thousands of travelers who traveled on that ship. The loss of this stuff, forgetting the fact of how it was polluting the ocean, but to dump all that seemed insane. So I went to the owners of the ship, proposed the notion of an auction, only to say we like this idea so much they took it to our far larger competitors, Sotheby's and Christie's. Those firms, as wonderful as they are, claim that it would take 10 years, if you could do that auction at all, to prepare for this monumental task. So the owners of the ship, knowing they had a window of 3 months in which to do anything, if anything was to be done, they had contracted with the people of Haiti to remove asbestos that had been discovered on board the ship. And the Haitians were going to be given the lovely job of removing the asbestos, just at a time asbestos had been determined to be a carcinogen. So the owners of the ship came back to me and said, okay, big shot, you have 3 months to do this auction if you want to do it. Well, I can tell you the conditions on board were unbearable. The heat was in excess of 120 degrees at all times. It was a 17-deck ship. No elevators were operating. You had to walk up and down to remove any object from the ship. And I couldn't find anybody quickly to work on this task of cataloging this massive project. So out of desperation, someone pointed me in the direction of a halfway house. This was in Virginia, being lived in by 200 people, all of whom were African American and all of whom had just recently been released from prison. That's why they were in a halfway house. And I went to the director of that house and said, I need your help. We need to hire these people to do this work. It will include counting the silverware, and make no mistake about it, every place setting for the 5,000 passengers could include as many as 26 utensils. It wasn't a fish knife that you were dealing with, it's what kind of fish knife that you wanted. But when he went on to say that if I hired these people, did I know that half of them probably had been in jail for theft, and that I'm going to have them counting the silverware, we're lucky if we had 2 spoons left at the end of the day. And I said, well, that was sort of a chance we had to take. And we did hire them, and I can assure you it was the most inspirational thing I've ever been involved in, because these folks work day and night for round the clock. And today, many, many years later, I proudly look back at that event as the world's largest auction and stayed friends with these folks. We went on to represent the Rosa Parks Archive, which is now at the Library of Congress, and I think it's fair to say would not have been there had it not, because it was a great feud that had developed after her death, and then how the courts had asked us to step in and bring some resolution to that, and now, as will become evident in the years ahead, one will see that Rosa Parks was very much more than just simply the little lady who didn't give up her seat on the bus, but rather was considering all her life what difference she could make to change the world. But in any case, why am I here? As a few years ago, the parent of a young daughter who had started as an undergraduate at Brandeis, somehow the word got to Sarah Shoemaker, who I'm sure is in the room, archivist and head of special collections, and Sarah somehow put 2 and 2 together and figured, here's a guy who gets involved in collections, could I assist somehow in helping the school acquire this most important archive? And it was a no-brainer kind of question. Of course, I would do everything I could. And if I did a little bit, we're very, very happy and pleased that it could be here. Delighted to meet Kitty Bruce. My daughter's graduating this year, so it's a happy day. Thank you all.
Thank you, Arlen. The actuarial tables are very benign with regard to our next 2 speakers, both of whom also knew Lenny Bruce. And it's a pleasure to introduce William Karl Thomas, and he will speak next about his own relationship to Lenny Bruce.
When I was 13, I bought a press camera and became a photojournalist selling articles to newspapers and magazines. When I was 19, I was a cocktail pianist in the French Quarter in New Orleans. I worked for a man named Frank Ray Pirelli, a nightclub comedian, owned a nightclub in partnership with another comedian named Shecky Green. Frankie wanted to be America's Federico Fellini, and he wanted to write and direct and produce offbeat films of social significance and controversy. Eventually he did produce 20 films and 4 plays and won some awards and more or less fulfilled his dream. But at that time, he was just an aspiring film writer. He discovered, even though he was 8 years older than me, he discovered I was a published photojournalist. He asked me to write screenplays with him. And although our writing was interrupted by my years in the service and combat in Korea, we ended up in 1956 in Hollywood, continue our writing together. And I discovered then that he had become a mentor, a tutor, and eventually a manager to an unknown comic named Lenny Bruce. Lenny also had film ambitions, and he saw the progress that we were making, and he asked me to collaborate with him on a 50-50 basis to write screenplays. We wrote 3 screenplays. We started to film one of them, but none of them ever made, with Lenny in the lead role and me as director of cinematography, but none of them made it to the screen, primarily because of financial mismanagement. But Frankie was ahead of his time in trying to encourage Lenny to create comedy records, which were a pioneering venue in that day. And Lenny was resistant to the idea, but Frankie got Fantasy to come down and record some of Lenny's performance, and they culled a few of his bits and put them in a compilation of 6 comedians in an album titled Interviews of Our Times. But they declined to do a solo album of Lenny because they said his work was too brief, too nebulous, and too controversial. Now, Lenny took pride in the fact that it was controversial, but he was surprised to think that his material was too nebulous or brief. And Frankie said, do something. So I went and sat through 3 of his 3 nights of performance with my stopwatch and my notebook. And on the 3rd night, we sat in cantors, and I explained to Lenny, I timed everything. Not one of your bits goes over 30 seconds. They're all 1-liners, 2-liners, and 3-liners. Frankie and I laugh at every one of them, but the audience only laughs at about every 3rd, 4th, or 5th one. And it's because either it goes over their head or it's controversial and they're on the other side of the controversy. And so I suggested, why don't we, if they think it's too brief and nebulous, why don't we sit down just like we did with the screenplays and script routines, take these 1-liners, expand them into larger routines. And Lenny was resistant, but when Fantasy didn't return calls, he agreed to do it. And just like with the screenplays, he'd get off work at 2, come to my place, we'd write until sunrise. I don't have time to explain all of the routines by any means. Most of them are explained in my book. There's a chapter called The Creative Process. But one of the most important ones that might, I think, be relative to some of the other speakers today is a routine that's known as Religions Incorporated. It began with a 1-liner. The 1-liner was based on the fact that the pontiff at that time, Pope Pius XII, was a man with a thin, ascetic face and a thin, large, hooked nose. When his picture was on Life magazine cover, Lenny decided that he'd put his face close to the mic, hold up the picture, and say, "You realize, of course, the Pope was Jewish." And it got such a visceral reaction from the audience. 50% laughed, 50% were outraged. And it was a very effective line, and he loved it. So he said, that's the first thing that we're going to write. And I said, I had a line from a poem a friend had written that ended up, the poem was about the difficulty in finding housing during World War II. And it said, you can't find a shack nor a tent nor a shed, but there ain't no use to shoot yourself dead, because they won't let you go where the angels dwell, and the politicians need all the space in hell. So I said, we'll take you, you die, you go to heaven, you're at the pearly gates, St. Peter's negotiating with you, and then St. Peter says, oh yeah, aren't you the guy that said the Pope is Jewish? And then you had this great debate with St. Peter about that line, and we can really build that. We kicked it around for a little while, didn't use it on that line. We used it later on a routine called Showbiz Heaven. But the line still hung there. And what really was the catalyst for it was that I had a bunch of dog-eared paperback thrift store books of the authors of that day: Ayn Rand, Philip Wiley, John Steinbeck, Pearl Buck, Vance Packard. Lenny didn't read much in those days. Later he read law books voraciously to defend himself. But back then he read Variety and Hollywood Reporter, and that was about it. He'd thumb through these books at my place, and he'd make me give him a critique about the book or the author, and he'd really irritate me by saying, taking snap judgments that Ayn Rand was a dyke, Philip Wiley was a faggot, John Steinbeck was a hawk, and Pearl Buck was sexually repressed. But he couldn't get a handle on Vance Packard because it was nonfiction. And he kept making me go further into books like The Power Elite and The Hidden Persuaders. And when I had used the term Madison Avenue boardroom about 10 times, finally he had an epiphany. And he put his fingers up to make a director's frame and said, "That's it. All the religious leaders are on Madison Avenue in the boardroom planning next year's religious hustle." And Oral Roberts is presiding, and there's Billy Graham and Bishop Sheen and Norman Vincent Peale and Rabbi Weiss and all the religious leaders of the day. It was a natural because those religious leaders of that day all had television shows, all had top ratings, and they also held a tremendous amount of power. And they used that power in a very conservative fashion, endorsing conservative politicians. So the thing kind of wrote itself, and of course, the Pope is Jewish. That line ended up as the capper, because at the end of this board meeting, where a lot of stuff that I don't have time to go through occurred, he gets a phone call from the Pope. Yes, operator, I'll accept the charges. And no, Billy Graham wants know if you can get him one of those Ferraro cars, and on with the Pope. And then the capper to the whole routine is the very last line, where he looks around suspiciously and says, "Don't worry, they don't know you're Jewish." That routine was the spark to a lot of other routines that we did. The Second Coming, the and political leaders who were hypocrites, and Lenny was the little boy who said that the emperor wore no clothes. So the end result was that all those routines were actually created. We wrote for 3 months, and the material in those 3 months became the bulk of the material in the first 3 fantasy albums. And the stuff that we wrote and it didn't work and we put it on the shelf, we dug it out years later and it became material from later years. Now, I don't mean to challenge the idea that Lenny wrote his own material. Frankie wrote gag lines for Lenny. Frankie taught Lenny how to impersonate voices. We are all made of the talents of those people we've been exposed to and who have helped us along the way. The material for those 3 albums were some of the best writing I ever did. Subsequently, I wrote 12 books. I've got Frankie's biography coming out soon, will be the 13th one. But we are all part of other people's training. And Lenny was unique in that he gave voice to so many things that the public at large wanted to say and didn't have a platform to say. And he said it in their language, in their time, with the complete honesty of their disenchantment with their leadership. So it was my privilege. If you want more details about some of the other routines, they're in my book, Lenny Bruce, The Making of a Prophet. And I'll be happy to answer any questions after the...
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Susan Silver, a comedy writer for the Mary Tyler Moore Show, for Maude, for Bob Newhart and others, an NPR commentator. It's a pleasure to welcome Susan here to the platform.
It's really an honor to be here. I recently lost a very dear friend of more than 40 years who happened to be Marty Garbus's best friend. His name was Gary Marshall, He was my mentor and my manager, and he was a comedy icon too. And he used to say he wanted to be the recess in the school day of comedy. He wanted to be the light, fun, no heavy message, not serious, academic kind of thing. And I look around at all of you serious, brilliant academicians, and so I'm the recess of this conference. Because the reason I'm here is Lenny Bruce's mother fixed me up with him when I was in college. And I want to go like this and say I'm blonde, but one other thing Gary said, in show business we have a term that's called hyphenates. You're a director/producer, a writer/director, an actor/waiter, usually. Anyway, when I retired from show business, I got very involved with Holocaust-related things. I worked for the Anti-Defamation League, I ran their Speakers Bureau, and I was the UN observer for the Simon Wiesenthal Center. So Gary said I was the original hyphenate, sitcom writer/Nazi hunter. So I guess I do fit in here because I see we have panels on the Holocaust and humor. I've just finished my memoir about being a woman in a man's world, about being a woman writing in the sort of beginning of feminism where comedy changed because, hopefully, of Mary Tyler Moore. But another thing in my book is I'm like Zelig, and I should say Ms. Zelig. I have encountered in my life every icon of my generation. It's kind of scary. I was in show business, I was in politics, and I'm kind of always in the right place at the right time, and as you can see, I'm not very shy, so it all worked out very well. We have to remember, as Christy said, the times we were living in. This was the early 60s. I'm much older than I look. And it was a time where, don't forget, on television, married couples were not even allowed to be shown in the same bed. They had to sleep in separate beds. We didn't even really know what feminism was until 1970, or 1962, when Betty Friedan wrote her book. And I grew up in a double bind of that. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is about as Midwest a person you could be. And when I grew up, all my friends wanted to go to college to get their MRS, or they'd be a teacher. I wanted to go to Hollywood and be a writer. But being an only child in a Jewish protective home, I wasn't allowed to cross the main street until I was 12. So I could only get to Northwestern my first 2 years. And then I escaped to Hollywood, to California, Sin City. I had an uncle out there who was also a famous writer, director, producer, and man about town. His name was Cy Howard, and I was living with him. If my parents only knew what it was like there, they never would have sent me, but that's another story, which we'll have a reference to Lenny in a minute. In doing research on Lenny, since I was going to be speaking from my personal experience, I found a really great article he did for Playboy in 1963 about what would happen if he had to play in Milwaukee. And of course, I wouldn't have been allowed to see him, but I just want to read a few pages of this article. It's so great, and it also shows how strange it was for this little Jewish virgin to meet Lenny Bruce. Let's say I'm working at the Crescendo, Lenny says. You know, I'll finish a show, some guy will come up to me and say, I'm a club owner, I'd like you to work for me. It's a beautiful club. You ever work in Milwaukee? Lots of people you know there. I mean, you'll do great, you'll kill them. You'll have a lot of fun. Do you bowl? The only thing is, I know that those clubs between Los Angeles and New York, the people in the audience are a little older than me. The most I can say to people over 50 is, thank you, I've had enough to eat. So I get to Milwaukee. The first thing that frightens me to death is they've got a 6:30 dinner show. And this was the home of, my parents were always talking about the early bird special. 6:30, Lenny says, in the afternoon, people are going to a nightclub. It's not even dark yet. I don't want to go in the house. It's not dark yet, man. If the dinner show is held up, it's only because the jello's not hard. The people look familiar, but I've never been to Milwaukee before. Then I realize these are the Gray Line sightseeing bus tours before they leave. It's where they come from. They're like 40-year-old chicks with prom gowns on. They don't laugh, they don't heckle, they just stare at me in disbelief. And there are walkouts every night. The owner says to me, well, I never saw you do that religious bit and those words you use. The chef is confused, the desserts aren't moving. I go to the men's room. I see kids in there, kids, 4 years old, kids. The kids are in awe of the men's room. This is the first time they've been in a place their mother isn't allowed to go in. Come on out. No, I'm gonna come in and get you. No, you're not allowed in here because everybody's doing making wet in here. In between the shows, I'm a walker. I'm getting nervous, and nudgy. The owner decides to cushion me in his next introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, the star of our show, Lenny Bruce. He's incidentally a GI, an ex-GI, a hell of a good performer, folks. A great kidder, you know? It's all a bunch of silliness up here. He doesn't mean what he says. He kids about the Pope, about Jewish religion, about colored people, white people. It's silly, it's a make-believe. He's a hell of a nice guy. He was at the Veterans Hospital today for a show. He did a show for the boys. Here he is. His mother's here. He's probably from here. She lives here in town, really. Now, a joke is a joke, right, folks? What the hell? I wish that you'd try to cooperate. Whoever has been sticking ice picks in the tires outside, it's not funny. Now, Lenny may kid about narcotics, homosexuality, things like that, and he gets walkouts. So that's the world I came from. And there I was, this little scared Jewish virgin, the night I met Lenny Bruce. So there's only one person who has their own chapter in my book of all the famous people, that's Lenny Bruce. This is my chapter on Lenny. It's New Year's Eve, 1964, 1965, I can't remember. I was out with a group of friends at someone's house, and a lively older woman was entertaining us. She was Sally Marr, a former stripper, but best known as the mother of Lenny Bruce. Lenny, the brilliant but troubled comedian, single-handedly changed comedy with his stream of consciousness, his cultural critique. He didn't tell jokes, he told truths. Dramatic-looking, with dark, soulful eyes and a sad smile, he was someone I admired, and yes, had a crush on. Imagine my joy and alarm when Lenny's mother took a liking to me and said, "You should meet my son. I'm going to call him and tell him to come to the party." What? Lenny Bruce, controversial, potentially dangerous, possibly druggy, coming to meet a Jewish virgin? Oi. Okay, as long as no one tells my mother. His mother did call him, and he came. I wondered why he didn't have a better place to be on New Year's Eve. He walked in, and it was smitten at first sight, on my side at least. I sat at his feet with a bunch of other girls as he mulled different topics. He pointed to the angels peeking out from the filigreed borders of the ceiling. According to Lenny, they now look shocked as they listened to him. We thought this was a brilliant observation, having not even noticed them ourselves. Everything he said was brilliant, and by the end of the evening, I was in love, or some crush-like facsimile thereof. He asked for my number and said maybe I could come down to his show the following week at the club he played in Hollywood called the Crescendo. I said, yes, of course. Then I called my uncle. By that time, I was living in an apartment, but I remained close to him, and he said, no way. This guy is way too dangerous for you. I asked why. He listed about 10 reasons, and then he said if I insisted on going out with Lenny Bruce, he was coming along as chaperone. And he did. He went with me to the show, which was racy, a little scary, and amazing. My uncle really admired Lenny. I was kind of glad that he had accompanied me, because now I was really scared to death. The secret garden beckoned. We waited at the bar. When Lenny emerged, we all had a drink. He and my uncle got along famously. I sat there, not saying a word, out of my element, and Lenny went and he wrote something on a napkin, and he handed it to me with a smile. It was a little drawing, an arrow with writing along before it bent around, and it said, Susan will go to the corner, but she's afraid to go around. Wow, was it that evident? After we talked a while, he went backstage and brought out a few pages of one of his routines and gave them to me. He signed it, Clark Gable found alive in Argentina. Love, Lenny Bruce. It turned out to be the famous bit about how to make your colored friends comfortable at parties. You're supposed to drop names like Uncle Ben, oh, I love that rice, Aunt Jemima, oh, the maple syrup. You drop that into the conversation. It was classic and became a collector's item, which I never would have sold, of course. Years later, it was stolen from my house in California. I was shocked when, not too long after our date, Lenny Bruce died. He OD'd in a gruesome way alone in his bathroom. He had been dating another Jewish college girl named Lotus Weinstock, who was a comic. My uncle couldn't stop from saying, "I told you so." Frankly, thank God he had, or who knows what kind of trouble I'd have gotten into. But truth be told, I wanted to take care of him. He had the most soulful eyes. He was so gentle, and he was a gentleman. He knew that he scared me to death, and he gave me a graceful way out. Now, a few years later, I worked with Mort Saul, who we've talked about. Mort was not a sweet soul. He still isn't. He's on Twitter now doing his routine in a chair. It's bizarre. Anyway, I worked for 6 months. I started as assistant. By the end of the 6 months, everybody ahead of me had been fired, and I was the producer of his talk show, because you weren't allowed to talk when Mort talked, or you weren't allowed to do anything that annoyed him. We became friends later, but anyway, Mort told the story of how he and Lenny used to work together upstairs and downstairs of a club, and half the time Lenny was arrested, so Mort had to go and do his show both places. Then later in my career, I worked with Marvin Worth, who was kind of the take care of the estate of Lenny, and he produced the movie, in which Dustin Hoffman did a good job. But I always wanted to tell Marvin, who thought Lenny was the sweetest, kindest person he ever knew, Dustin Hoffman was not nearly as sexy as Lenny was.